What makes a successful life? Whether we think about it or not, every day we live out our answer to that question. Our choices become a story about what we value. Together, they make us who we are. In today's episode, one poet's iconoclastic answer to that question and what you and I might be able to learn from it about what it takes to live a good life. You're listening to I Heart This. I'm Ben Lord. Let's talk about what we love. Several times during my years as a high school science teacher, I would walk into class all fired up to teach about mitosis, only to find a student in tears. Usually, she would see me come in and start wiping tears away. A friend would put a reassuring hand on their shoulder, look at me seriously and say, "She might need a minute, Mr. Lord. Dartmouth just turned down her application." From the outside, it can be easy for people to roll their eyes at what seems like melodrama, but that's probably because they've either forgotten just how monumental those rejection letters were, or they never knew. That student had lived half of her life working late into the evening to prove to some admission committee that she was okay, that she was smart, that she was worth it. She'd lived the last few years in a fierce, usually unspoken competition. Her friends all knew her class rank. Her parents had pushed her in subtle or not-so-subtle ways until the idea that anything other than engineering or medicine or law would be a disappointment. All around her was a simple, high-stakes story. You either worked hard, got good grades, got into a good college, got a good job, and were set up with a nice house and a successful life, or you fell off that path somewhere and ended up flipping burgers. If my tearful student was dramatic, it was because she was living a high-stakes drama. Life was confronting her with some profound questions. What makes a successful life? And would she get to live one? These are questions worth asking. Each life has its own version of a rejection from Dartmouth. The cultural waters in which we swim provide a kind of subliminal answer to the question, what makes a successful life? In a small town in Montana, success might be getting out. In the suburbs of New York and Boston, success is a lawn like a golf course and a gleaming SUV parked in front of a sprawling house with a pool and a hot tub in the backyard. On the internet, success might be a certain number of Instagram followers, and in science, success might be a Nobel. Part of us knows that these external measures of success are hollow. We're supposed to say things like, what really matters is that you're happy, or that you're making a difference in the world, or what really matters is love. But we don't always act as if we believe that. And if we do, then what do we make of ourselves when we are unhappy, or stymied, or lonely? Are we failures? By almost every conventional measure of writing success, Elizabeth Gilbert was successful even before her blockbuster Eat, Pray, Love. By her 35th birthday, her stories and articles had appeared in Esquire, GQ, and the New York Times Magazine. She'd published 3 books, each of which had been nominated for, or won, awards like the Pushcart Prize and the National Book Award. She'd been so successful that when she pitched the idea of a travel memoir to Viking Press, they gave her a $200,000 advance to go eat, pray, and love her way around the world. Not bad for someone who hadn't taken so much as an undergraduate writing class. After her travels, Elizabeth accepted a residency at the University of Tennessee to teach some undergraduate writing classes of her own, and write the book that would become her most recognized bestseller. It was there that she learned about another, unrelated Gilbert, who had held the same residency just before her. Her students spoke reverently of Jack Gilbert, an old poet who had taught his undergraduate protégés almost nothing about literary agents or publication. Instead, he'd inspired them to live lives of authenticity. He treated them with warmth and interest and care. He'd made them believe that the most beautiful poem they could write was their own beautiful life. He taught them to, as he says in his poems, have the stubbornness to accept their gladness in the ruthless furnace of this world. Elizabeth had never heard of this enigmatic writer before, and so she began to read his poetry. And as she did, she was so profoundly moved that she had the words "stubborn gladness" tattooed on her arm. Jack's life was as surprising as his poetry. He flunked out of a Pittsburgh high school and worked odd jobs until the University of Pittsburgh admitted him, seemingly by some oversight. After graduation, Jack worked in Paris and then Italy. He fell in love with an Italian girl, but her family sent him packing, convinced that he would never be able to provide for their daughter. In San Francisco, a year later, Jack hung out with Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac, but considered himself too romantic to be a beat. It was there that he published his first book of poems at 37 to near instant acclaim, a kind of celebrity that just doesn't happen in poetry. He was nominated for prizes and fellowships. He had a photo shoot in Vogue, for Christ's sake. That happens to no poets ever. And then Jack accepted a Guggenheim and went to Europe again and disappeared. He wouldn't publish another book for 20 years. Fame is a lot of fun, he later said, but it's not very interesting. After about 6 months, I found it boring. There are so many things to do, so much life to live. Jack spent much of that life as a cash-strapped wanderer in Europe, writing poems that celebrated the places he visited and his passionate love affairs. He was never quite homeless, but seemed to care very little for the comforts that money could buy. He seldom gave readings, and in his 87 years he gave only 2 interviews and published only 5 books of poetry, which is why Elizabeth Gilbert had no idea who he was until her students whispered to her about her iconoclastic predecessor as the writer-in-residence at the University of Tennessee. When he died a few years later, even the publishers of some of the biggest literary journals in America had no idea who he was. Linda Gregg, one of Jack's lovers, a fellow poet, and a lifelong friend, said of him, "All Jack ever wanted to know was that he was awake, that the trees in bloom were almond trees, and to walk down the road to get breakfast. He never cared if he was poor or had to sleep on a park bench." I learned about the life and poetry of Jack Gilbert from an essay by Elizabeth Gilbert that she wrote as a kind of ode to him and his work. And in it, I think there is something to learn about the nature of success. By the conventional standards, Jack Gilbert's life was a failure. He had thrown away his shot at fame. He had no children. His romances all ended. The only woman he married died of cancer in her 30s. He lived most of his life in obscurity. When the Paris Review's Gordon Lish asked how his self-imposed exile had affected his career, Jack laughed and answered, "I suppose it's been fatal, but I don't really care." And yet here is one of the most celebrated writers of our time extending to him a kind of breathless salute of gratitude. When I discovered the poetry of Jack Gilbert, I was just as taken with it as Elizabeth was. And I wondered, what would Jack have to say to my student wringing her hands over college admissions, or to those of us chasing dreams of comfortable houses or high-paying jobs or likes or followers? What would he consider to be a successful life? I think I found an answer in a poem of his called "I Imagine the Gods." He says, "I imagine the gods saying, 'We will make it up to you. We will give you 3 wishes,' they say. 'Let me see the squirrels again,' I tell them. 'Let me eat some of the great hog stuffed and roasted on its giant spit and put out steaming in the winter of my neighborhood, when I was usually too broke to afford even the 100 grams I ate, so happily, walking up the cobbles past the street of the moon and the street of the birdcage makers, the street of silence and the street of the little pissing. We can give you wisdom,' they say in their rich voices. 'Let me go, at last, to Huguette,' I say, the Algerian student with her huge eyes, who timidly invited me to her room when I was too young and bewildered that first year in Paris. Let me at least fail at my life think, they say patiently, we could make you famous again. Let me fall in love one last time, I beg them. Teach me mortality. Frighten me into the present. Help me to find the heft of these days, that the nights will be full enough, and my heart feral. I fret about my failures, and Jack asks the gods, let me at least fail at my life. I worry that I might squander an afternoon. Jack blows his one wish on squirrels. I get the sense that for Jack, the only wasted life is the one that hasn't been squandered. Teach me mortality. Frighten me into the present. In the 1987 film Wall Street, Michael Sheen plays an up-and-coming, high-powered day trader named Bud Fox. Now, Bud is a man frantically chasing dollar signs, but to what end? In one scene, he confides to his girlfriend, I think if I can make a bundle of cash before I'm 30 and get out of this racket, I'll be able to ride my motorcycle across China. I'm Bud. My student, crushed by a Dartmouth rejection, is Bud. This kind of tragedy is so common that it's invisible. Kids tell themselves that if they just get through college, they can finally live their lives. Their parents tell themselves that if they can just max out their pension, they can travel when they retire. We get more stuff to make our lives more comfortable, and then we buy a new security system to keep our stuff safe. We get up and walk through the same routine day after day because we just have so many things to get done. We would let go on the dance floor, except that there are all these people watching. We don't let ourselves fall in love because of how much it would hurt when it ends. Jack knew all that hurt too. He wasn't naive. He was no stranger to loss. After his wife Michiko died, he wrote this poem called Married. He says, I came back from the funeral and crawled around the apartment crying hard, searching for my wife's hair. For 2 months, got them from the drain, the vacuum cleaner, under the refrigerator and off the clothes in the closet. But after another Japanese woman came, there was no way to be sure which were hers, and I stopped. A year later, repotting Michiko's avocado, I find this long, black hair tangled in the dirt. All of this loss and grief, and yet what does Jack beg the gods? Let me fall in love one last time. Bud Fox says, if I can make a bundle and get out of this racket, and Jack says, what are you waiting for, man? Go now. Go now. Do you know what success is? I think Jack would ask if that was even the right question. I think that if he were in my classroom the day rejection came raining down on that one student's broken heart, he wouldn't ask whether she wanted to pass to the guidance counselor like I did. I think he'd ask instead, do you have the courage to live all the misery and the joy, to take in your only and all too brief life? Or as one commentator summed up Jack's attitude, the world is terrible and wonderful, and our obligation is to joy. In his poem, A Brief for the Defense, Jack says, sorrow everywhere, slaughter everywhere. If babies are not starving someplace, they are starving somewhere else, with flies in their nostrils. But we enjoy our lives because that's what God wants. Otherwise, the mornings before summer dawn would not be made so fine. The Bengal tiger would not be fashioned so miraculously well. The poor women at the fountain are laughing together between the suffering they have known and the awfulness in their future, smiling and laughing while somebody in the village is very sick. There is laughter every day in the terrible streets of Calcutta, and the women laugh in the cages of Bombay. If we deny our happiness, resist our satisfaction, we lessen the importance of their deprivation. We must risk delight. We can do without pleasure, but not delight, not enjoyment. We must have the stubbornness to accept our gladness in the ruthless furnace of this world. To make injustice the only measure of our attention is to praise the devil. If the locomotive of the Lord runs us down, we should give thanks that the end had magnitude. We must admit that there will be music despite everything. We stand at the prow again of a small ship, anchored late at night in the tiny port looking over the sleeping island. The waterfront is 3 shuttered cafes and 1 naked light burning. To hear the faint sound of oars in the silence as a rowboat comes slowly out and then goes back is truly worth all the years of sorrow that are to come. Thank you, Jack, for your poems, your example, and your stubborn gladness. My friends, a more appreciative society is a better one. That is not just my opinion. It has been demonstrated by psychologists and behavioral economists and sociologists and in public health. The more we appreciate those around us, the more cohesive and stable and fair and resilient our society is. So do some iHeart homework this week and send a heartfelt gratitude to someone who isn't expecting it. You'll be making the world a better place for all of us. You can also send an iHeart This episode to a friend. Pick a story that will inspire them to take delight in something new. iHeart This is written, edited, and produced by me, Ben Lord. Our logo was designed by Brian Imaro Cribbs. Our website is iHeartThisPodcast.com. We're on Facebook at iHeart This Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. And as always, be kind, be curious, be thankful.